This is week 10 in pastoral care, pastoral theology. We're talking today about the focus on shepherding and earth making, and we'll kind of review the questions and come to Dijkstra's chapters as we come to them. And then we'll end the discussion with our sharing of our information or insights on genograms and family systems. So our first question for the week is about pastoral care and pastoral theology. Do we have some sense of an integrated definition? What do we mean when we say it? And is it kind of different from when we started the course?
I think I started the course with like the sort of traditional shepherd idea. But I'm actually really, maybe with a little bit of, midwife in there. But I'm actually really interested from this point on exploring Kornfeld's metaphor of gardener. Like, I really enjoy gardening just as a hobby. And, I feel like that is going to be a productive exploration for me in the future. So I'm interested in that.
I was intrigued by the Culbertson quote that was offered on the PowerPoint about this is all about relationships and healing. And I don't think that I would have thought about wholeness and healing so much as sort of taking care of people. So wholeness in relationship and in relationship with ourselves, with others, and then with God. So seeing it three different ways, which I don't think when I started the class, I could have ever articulated that. Maybe I didn't now, but I think I know where I'm at it.
Yeah, for me, I think just reading the Culbertson book, the idea of shepherding, I don't know, I guess I haven't put it all together before, but it made a lot of sense to me, even though it's the classic image. And the way that he put it forward as you have to be careful with it, right? That you can't shepherd all the time. It's time and place. And I feel like that kind of goes along with Kornfeld's solution-based thing, right? You approach them where they are. And so in that way, the shepherd needs to be responsive. So that's kind of where I'm at right now is I also like the way Culbertson just sort of said, when you approach people, you can't be in shepherding mode all the time. It might not be the thing that you want to do that will be helpful for other people. And I think I've seen pastors be in shepherd mode all the time, and it just looks exhausting. So I think that's where I'm at.
Well, that's a real easy segue into the next question, which is what are some of the inherent tensions in the shepherd model? And obviously exhaustion would be one. What did you guys think about the concept of self-sacrifice?
Oh,
a lot of the reading made a lot of that.
Before we jump into shepherding, I just wanted to have like a fun little note that in the lecture, how there was the Foot Flats cartoon. Yeah, I grew up reading those. And
cool.
This is a plush toy of the dog.
The smart dog.
Yeah, the dog. And so it's just very important to have a companion in the shepherding who's very reliable and loyal. So this is my dog, who I've had since I was a teenager and came with me from Australia. So anyway.
Awesome. Tell the truth. Did you name it? Did you name it Beyond the Dog?
Oh, no. That would be sacrilege. You cannot. He's just the dog.
Awesome.
Anyway, I wanted to introduce him. Anyway,
hello, dog.
Continue.
That's great. No, that's wonderful. So it points to that whole issue of the conflict or the tension in shepherding of trying to do it on your own. I kept thinking sheepdogs, and I had friends who raised sheepdogs, and so I get that kind of like circling around kind of behavior. Were there any other tensions initially that you wanted to raise about shepherds?
Well, I just like the whole peaceful sort of image of it. Like I didn't grow up in a farm, but I grew up in a rural area, and so I knew what it was like to be around sheep, and it's just not peaceful.
Right.
They're loud and they're really quite big. And I suppose I haven't been around them as much as an adult, but as a child, they felt a little menacing, like not menacing, but they were heavy, you know, like compared to a child. And yeah, like it just, and the peacefulness of the pastoral scene, you know, I think doesn't exist necessarily.
Dr. Swain made an interesting observation about liking goats better than she liked sheep.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that brings us back to that self-sacrifice question that I ask. Is it, are these people you want to sacrifice your life for? And is that an inherent tension in the shepherding metaphor?
Right.
I don't know about that, but I mean, we could talk about self-sacrifice, but I want to, yeah, like Shada, I grew up in a rural area as well in Minnesota, and my best friend, his father had a small flock of sheep, and they are just dirty. They are not clean animals. And my mom, because we were in a rural area, and we lived in the town, but my mom got some goats for my siblings to show at 4-H. So I also am familiar with goats, and they are very friendly. So yeah, I related to Dr. Swain talking about the sheep and the goats, and being a good show, good. I combine the words. A good goat and a bad sheep makes sense to me. But yeah, that self-sacrifice. As a shepherd, I mean, I think that's one of the tensions, right? Because you don't want to. We can't be Jesus. We can be the shepherd following the shepherd, and I think that's what I'm talking about with the exhaustion that I see some pastors get to, where they are just constantly in that mode of wanting to help, the whole person all the time, which is admirable, but it ultimately will. I mean, that's the burnout piece, right? It's
sure.
If
that's the prevailing metaphor, it's what the expectation is, or the expectation that people bring to it. How could you possibly not, sacrifice your own self for us, sort of deal? Especially if you're following Jesus, who did the ultimate thing, So yeah, it's kind of weird. Do you think that Jesus had anything in mind? I mean, he would know the same thing about goats and sheep that we do, right? Do you think he had anything in mind by that? I mean, I'd much rather be a herder of goats.
It's kind of like a herder of cats.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've always, I mean, there's tension in that metaphor for me too, because we think of sheep as the ones who follow, but follow blindly. But as Dr. Swain points out, they don't just go where you tell them. You have to gently lead them. And I haven't had experience like she has, but yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. How much can we take from that metaphor that Jesus throws out there?
Right. And I'm sure I don't know enough about the cultural, social history of the time, but I mean, sheep were so important, right? Like they weren't pets, they were like an industry. So like, what does that have to do with it? I wonder too, like their centrality, and maybe it's less about the particular animal and more about, I don't know, something about their centrality in life.
Like the grapes and the bread or whatever. Yeah. It's central to the culture. Yeah.
I think of the verse, all we like sheep have gone astray, right? Is it Isaiah or something?
Yep.
Yeah. I don't know.
Well, okay, I'll switch gears for a second to chapter 5, because that was about the courageous shepherd, and it was based on Campbell's work in 1981, actually written by him, I guess, right? So I just have a couple of highlights for you. His argument was that we've overlooked the courage that it takes to be a shepherd. And his point was that it takes courage for us to walk into the dark valleys of other people's lives. And we sometimes underplay that or don't recognize what a struggle that is. He makes a big deal of the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament considerations, where there's only one time that self-sacrifice is mentioned in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, of course, it almost dominates the image. He talks about care and concern from the Old Testament and consolation and hope from the New Testament. I just finished a paper on the Old Testament, Ezekiel 34, the bad shepherds and the good shepherd. And it's interesting because it sets up so well and relates so well to Matthew and to John, particularly, and of course to the Psalm 23 kind of harkens back to that. Campbell's point was that pastoral used to mean everything that a preacher did or everything that a pastor did, teaching and preaching, and that takes some courage. But he was focusing in. I think what he said was that the guy before, from chapter 4, Hiltner, separated out our notion of pastoral care from these other things. And I kind of got the feeling that Campbell was saying it takes more courage to do the kind of things that we think of as pastoral care than it does for teaching and for preaching and things like that. And as a result, people do it more or do it less than they see their role as an educator or as a preacher. He was very critical of Hiltner for two things primarily. Number one, that Hiltner never challenged the way things are in the church with the minister as the center of all ministry. But more than that, I think he challenged him based on this whole idea of non-directive, client-centered, Rogerian, I think Dr. Swain referred to it as therapy or counseling, where you kind of let the person wander wherever they want to wander. I'm really kind of putting my own prejudice there, right? So non-directive takes very little courage, I think, and that's where Campbell was coming from. He talked about being a tough guy versus a tender guy, and tried to make the distinction that what we're talking about here in pastoral care is courage for others, not courage for yourself. So not trying to defend yourself or not trying to self-aggrandize, but to really focus that courage on doing for others. And then he went through a whole series of comparisons about Jesus, that Jesus was challenged often by the Pharisees and by lawyers and people who would be around him. And he replied in a very calm and, not threatened, not self-defensive way to those things. He called that courage. He talked about Jesus's actions like touching lepers and eating with sinners, and that they were courageous. The third thing, courage in his suffering, obviously Gethsemane and Calvary. So the thing that kind of wondered me about the second one a little bit is that there are places in Luke where it's recorded that Jesus kind of slips away or doesn't confront something that could be confrontable, or there's a crowd there and all of a sudden, boom, he's out the back door sort of deal. So I didn't get time to look up the specific references in Luke, but I know from Dr. Heen's course that was there. So I wonder what this guy, Campbell, would say about those particular passages, because they always intrigue me because they're kind of counter what we think about Jesus. Ends up the chapter saying there's no right technique for all. And if you're trying to determine whether you're having success being a shepherd or not, he said, number one, that your followers are going to experience rest and health as a result of your interventions instead of increased anxiety or narrowing of their focus. And number two, that it has to be at some risk or cost to you. You can't really shepherd without risking something of yourself. Bang the computer. So given that, and given what we know about the decontextualizing that we did about the shepherd and the shepherd's role in real life and sheep and goats, I guess the question is, in our own context, what does the shepherd metaphor either mean or not mean to us?
Well, I really liked the way Dr. Swain talked about it in the lecture, where it wasn't so much in terms of like how she talked about the sheep following her voice, right? That there's sometimes a sense of like by sheer force of will, you will herd these animals into, and that's possible through strategy and determination, I suppose. But that's also much more like higher energy intensive. And it completely denies it's a personhood of the congregation, but also like the sheep nature, right? Which is that like this sense of uncovering this idea that sheep can have a relationship with their shepherd and listen to their voice, right? Like subverts the whole dumb sheep thing. And I just thought like, well, that's like a fun kind of turning upside down of how we see the metaphor, right? That they're not like a dog, right? They're not going to come when you whistle, but part of the shepherd's work is to not just be like an outside coercive force, but to to create a relationship enough so that the sheep respond to their voice. And I just thought that was pretty moving. Like, I feel like that's something I can work with.
There was an element in that same story about self-interest of the sheep, like the pasture that they were in no longer had food. And so you kind of like harness the self-interest of the people of the flock. And I think of that in church sometimes, do we pay enough attention to the people, or do we just try to herd them with our staff and our rod or whatever?
Right.
I also like that image of the voice and building relationships. It goes counter to, as she mentioned, sort of the consumeristic way that the sheep are commodities, right? So if we think about sheep as just of use to us, then what's the point of being a shepherd? You're just getting, something for yourself. But if you make a relationship, if you break it down to the level of how do you work with these animals or these people, the only way to get people to follow is to build real relationships. And going to the courageous point, I mean, that it takes a tremendous amount of courage to build a relationship, to know when to speak up, right? To intervene in someone's life. I naturally tend to wait and watch. It's just kind of how my nature is. So hearing courageous is helpful for me to be reminded that it takes a step sometimes to really, move in there, not to tell people what to do, but even to say, how are you? Can we talk? Right? Let's go get some coffee and see where you are. That there's courage even in intervening in other people's stories. So, yeah.
Are we done with the shepherd model? Can we go to the next one? The living human document. And Adam, you want to take us through chapter 2, and then we'll kind of answer the question afterwards.
Sure. So this is Charles V. Gherkin, and in the Dykstra book. And so he starts out his chapter saying, pastoral counselors are more than anything else listeners to and interpreters of stories. So he starts with talking about stories and how it's impossible, we know, for humans to separate experience from language. Language is experience, and experience is language. Everything that happens to us, we put it into a framework of language. And we ourselves take our own meanings for granted, that we think in our own egotistical way that whatever we think is what everyone else thinks. So he sort of starts with that. But then, realizing then that that's not true, right? The way that other people experience the world and the other way that other people make meaning out of language and experience is different in different contexts and in different people, right? Everyone in every situation. The pastoral counselor is not only a listener to stories, he or she is also a bearer of stories and a story. So, just sort of looking at my highlights, sorry. The art of pastoral counseling is in large part the art of drawing upon that imagerial storehouse in the formation of a response to the heard story of the one seeking help. So it's taking your own story, hearing other people's stories, and making sense out of it together. And so the big idea, as you can get from the lecture and the title, The Living Human Document, he goes then into his personal story about how he met this guy, Boyson, who was a pastor in starting in the 1890s, and then became kind of the father of clinical pastoral care. I'm not saying that right, but that meeting him got him to think about how people are stories, that the living human document, each of us is a document to be read and to be studied and to be looked into. Part of Boyson's interest in that was in mental illness. And so obviously at the turn of the other century, things weren't understood the way they are now. But part of Gherkin's idea is that we've broken it down too clinically sometimes, that we've separated out, right, body from mind. And we know that can't actually be pulled apart, that we are of a whole. So yeah, the living human document is one whole thing, and approaching it with that in mind is a specifically sort of Christian idea that we that we approach it. I might be mixing up my chapters here. Yeah, but anyway, that's the idea, that we can read people, and to make sense of it together is the idea.
Yeah, I think the book metaphor works for me, maybe as a former librarian. I don't know. It's like when you pick up a new book, what are the things that you do? And I think that's what Dr. Swain is kind of asking us with this open-ended question, like what's the door opener for somebody who regards another person as a living human document to be interpreted and to be studied and all that sort of thing.
Well,
I don't know, when I pick up a book,
like, tell me your story or something, like something as simple as that, just inviting people to tell their story, and like in their own way, right? In a way that understands that we're not the author of that document, right? They are, and we may be reading it, and that involves reading it as they would tell it.
It's kind of like you need the summary first, sort of deal, I think. And then you move into different parts of it. So it's kind of like reading the back cover of a book first, kind of to get a taste of it. So do you ask something like, kind of what's going on here, or what's happened? I'm thinking particularly in a hospital setting.
Mm-hmm. Or how did you get here? Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. Just tell me your story. How did you get here? When you ask that, you get what's in process, which is how I kind of linked it to Kornfeld's solution-based theory. People are already working through what they need to work through. So if you just open it up with that, where are you? And then you get to read their story. I agree.
Yeah. Okay. We're good. So now it's chapter 3, I guess, the living human web. So we take that picture and we put it into a context, I guess.
Right.
Rada, exactly. Do you want to take us through?
Yeah. So I'm just looking at the year. This chapter 84, 96. So it's sort of written as something of a answer or an expansion. I wouldn't necessarily say opposition to the idea of the human document, but definitely supposed to expand the idea of it, being that obviously, people don't exist in isolation from their contexts, right? And so their contexts are going to intersect with their experience in lots and lots of different ways. And that's going to have an impact on their story. So their story isn't just suspended sort of, and unto themselves. The story is connected to a web of relationship. And so the author is suggesting a web as a useful metaphor, more useful, I think she thinks, than just reading the document. Because I think part of what she's trying to say is that, the advocating in the part about a human document, in that it becomes a collaboration, like the reading and the hearing, there's a collaboration and a co-creation, eventually a co-creation of the story. The author here is just saying, putting a little bit of a caveat around that, saying a caregiver can only do that insofar as they understand and appreciate the intersectionality of that person's story. And they have to recognize that they will be limited by not having that same experience, right? So I think she's trying to put boundaries around the assumption that someone can just be read and understood, right? That there are limits on what we can empathize and understand. And so, so she brings up in, regard to feminism and certainly, well, she's specifically talking about feminism mostly in terms, but I think she briefly talks about other kinds of social locations and situations. And let's see what else.
Can I throw a weird one in?
Yeah.
The thing that kept, as I was browsing it, the thing that kept screaming out to me was kind of I think it's the Heisenberg principle. It's like anytime you study something, it changes it because of your impact as an observer. Right. And I kept thinking about how that plays into this. We bring our own intersectionality to the person who is seeking care.
Right.
And so we change them just by kind of who we are. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. And that becomes part of the web of relationship, right, for sure. And the author also brings up this idea of second culture. Like she says, many feminists and people of color have pointed out that the subordinates in a society, so the marginalized, already intimately know the foreign realities of at least two worlds, that of their own and that of the dominant group. So, and so, again, because of this kind of knowledge of two realities, I think, what she's saying is that they exist in a different space, right? Where someone who doesn't have a knowledge of those two realities, they cannot enter into that space with them. And then that can be okay, right? Like, to recognizing that limit in and of itself is also a good thing in the counseling space. Like, it's not necessarily, it is a limitation, but it's not a limitation, right? Like the recognition of it allows the reality of that other person's intersectionality and so I guess she's challenging a little bit this sense of, like, with reading the human document, there's this sense of being known, right? Being read and known, and she's backing up and saying a little bit, at some point there are some things you can't know. There's some things you can't share about that other person. And that is okay but as long as that's recognized, because if it's not recognized, the assumption of knowing can be damaging to the goals of the healing relationship. And so it's about hearing, it's about truly hearing the voices of the people that we're with, right? Recognize, like, if we assume that we can know, and if we assume that we can know more than we can know, right, then we can't actually really hear them. So there you go. That's
great. I mean, how do we translate that into an opening question, I guess, would be important, because saying the same thing, tell me your story, is kind of like coming at it from a different perspective. So it needs to be something relational. It needs to be something.
Well, maybe something like, what was that like for you? Like maybe like, right? Like implies a recognition that I can't know what that was like for them.
I was thinking about something maybe about the people, if there are other people in the room, or if there are other people that have come and gone while you're there, to try to say, kind of, who are these people? how do you fit in there? I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't read the chapter as you were talking. The intersectionality piece is obviously huge, and recognizing the caregivers' limits is super important. I was also wondering, just thinking about the living human web, you talked about we can't really know the other person. We think, there's the document, we can read them like a book, but that's not entirely true. Is it also about knowing the person's context? Because I feel like sometimes in care giving, the person may not even recognize the depth, or may not have perspective on themselves. So, digging deeper as a caregiver, in healthy ways, who does this person know? What is their family like? So, being aware of the bigger picture of their web and your own web, right? Whether that has to do with whatever intersectionalities that means.
Mm-hmm.
That came to mind for me. So, what question to ask? I guess, yeah. I guess you wouldn't want to say who do you know, but what's your family like? Who do you spend your time with? I don't know, just to give you an idea of the world that they come from.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I think it's a really good idea. I think it might be hard to implement as an opening gambit. Maybe it's like we start with the book that's in front of us, and then we look at the shelf of books or the library that it belongs in. I don't know. I'm gone on my library land. I'm sorry. Well, anything else on the web? There's one last model, and that's the Trinitarian information that Dr. Swain ended the lecture with. She asked us to kind of think of what might be involved there. And I'm going to take the easy one, and I'm going to say I really believe I have weird ideas about the Trinity. I totally confess that up front, but I think it's in the relationship with the three persons, if you want to call them that. I don't see them existing except as in relationship to each other. I know that's kind of weird, but it seems to me that it's kind of like taking the web kind of metaphor one step further and saying, I only exist. It sounds weird in this situation, but I only exist because of you, and you only exist because of me. And so we have a deeper relationship than just a connection on a web. So I don't.
No, that's not weird at all. That's like social Trinitarianism, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's a thing.
Right.
Not weird.
Well, weird in the sense of pastoral care. It's like, yeah. I don't know. I'm going to be quiet because I don't have any idea about it.
No, that sounds like, is it Ubuntu, the idea?
Yeah, that's where I am. Yeah.
Yeah, and it also, the way you said it made me think of Richard Rohr. I don't know if I get his daily emails, which I don't always read, but when I do check in, that's his latest thing is about the Trinity and the cosmic Christ and how they are constantly pouring out of each other and into each other. I think that helps me understand the Trinity, which has always been a complete mystery when I try to think about it at all. But that image of three cups pouring into each other makes a lot of sense to me. So if it's earth making, pain bearing, life giving, holding, suffering, transforming, these things don't happen by themselves. They happen in relationship, in continued relationship with each process, and that's helpful to think about.
So in a weird way, and hopefully not a sick way, but a healthy way, a life-giving way, when I am trying to give care, I'm also seeking care, it seems to me. How's that?
Well, right. Like, I understand where you're like, okay, yeah, you have to be careful about that. It's like, I think it's not so much seeking, but rather just the acknowledgement that we cannot be unchanged by our encounters with people.
Right.
Yeah.
Transformed. Yeah. I'm with you.
And I also really liked how in the lecture, Dr. Swain was talking about holding space, suffering space, transforming space. So in terms of like concretely what it means to have a Trinitarian model of pastoral care, like that idea of space was really helpful for me to figure out what that even meant or what that could be or look like, in the sense of like, because that's what we're trying to do in a larger sense pastorally with everything, but in the counseling relationship, the space between people, right, and like holding that sacred space in that sacred moment, and just seeing like those parts of it, right, like creating and holding it, and then being really present in it, right, the suffering, right, which is like incarnating yourself in it, right, like making sure you're there, and then having it not be static, not being a static space, but a transformative space, right, like that there's movement within the space. That just seems like those are three really important parts of it, like making the space, showing up in the space, and allowing for movement in the space.
I think that's well put. I the only thing I'd add to it is you can't do that by yourself. That's where the flow happens between the two people involved.
Right. They would have to, like, I guess, like this sense that they consent to the space, I suppose, right? And they also show up authentically in the space and allow for transformation in the space.
To be open to it. Yeah.
Like it has to be both.
There was somewhere it talked about earning a place, and I don't know where, I can't even tell you where it was from, but earning a place and how easy it is to lose a place in that caregiving situation. And that resonates with what you're talking about, I think. So anything else on Trinitarianism? God love us. Well, shall we talk about family structures and genograms to end the day? How's that?
Okay.
Anybody want to go first?
I'm happy to go first. So, well, I'll reiterate the information for Dr. Swain's benefit. I already told these guys that my dad is sort of a really, really private person, and I promised him that my genogram would only be seen by the professor. So I'm not going to put it up here as the other guys will for shared viewing. But, you know, I enjoyed doing the genogram. It wasn't so much that really anything new came to me from it, given that I've done them before and I'm sort of interested in family dynamics anyway. But recognizing a few things, you know, again, was interesting. One thing that is kind of fascinating is that there are some real sort of, I would say, structural similarities in the life of my husband and my father, which I did not recognize at all until I did my first genogram in CPE, and they're like, hey, I'm like, what? So they were both adopted, though my dad was adopted by his grandfather and my husband is adopted, you know, closed adoption. They both had either a father or a stepfather figure who was alcoholic and went into recovery. And my dad did not ever know or have any relationship with his real father, though he did with his mother. And my husband has never sought or had any relationship with his birth parents. And so that was kind of interesting. Like, I didn't even notice that until I did a genogram like 15 years ago, which is, it's just funny to me because they're very different people, like personality-wise, very different. But these trappings of their life, it was fascinating to see. there's also some continuing levels of loss. My husband's father died when my husband was 14, and then so recently coming to recognize after talking with my mother-in-law that his father, so my husband's father's mother died when he was a young child, and then he was very, very close to his eldest sister. They were a, Catholic family of 7 children, and he was the baby. And so when his mother died, his eldest sister went into this maternal role, and then she died when he was like a junior in high school. And so this incredible loss, and he just turned his back on religion and joined the Navy. And it's like, so this marked loss in 2 generations, in 2 successive generations, was interesting to note. And also, like, on my side of the family, like a pattern of immigration. My mother's parents immigrating from Europe to Australia, my dad immigrating from South Africa to Australia, now me immigrating Australia to US, like, so just noticing all those levels of immigration. And just how that changed the expectations of the family, what families do, right? Like when I came here, my mom's best friend was like questioning, like, why would you let her do that? I could never, like, don't, yeah. And my mom's like, nah. Like, not like she doesn't care about me, but she's like, well, like her parents, like, came to Australia and the rest of her siblings went to the US, and like she would rarely see them. And my dad, like, came to Australia and never saw his mom again. And, it's just like, it was just seriously like what the family, like, that was the normal, and where it was like uncountenanceable for her best friend. What else? I confess to having trouble to seeing triangulation, right? Like I read it in the book and was supposed to be looking for it. And I'm just like, I'm having this sort of block around seeing it and how it plays out. I don't know what's about that. I'll have to think about why I just can't seem to apply it and notice it in relationships. I don't know what's up with that. Another interesting thing about family was that my grandparents on my mother's side, they divorced, and then my grandfather entered into another relationship. They never got married, but long term. But they all lived on the same street, and so I had like, and they were friends, and so like I had my grandmother and then my step grandmother, and we would all just sort of be together, and it took a while for me growing up to recognize that was not normal either. I mean, it was a good thing, but it was like, well, that doesn't always happen. So, and just how it really could have been different because my maternal grandfather was really not, I loved him and he called me his little monkey, but I don't think he was a very good person. In hearing about the way he conducted his life, and maybe he regretted some of the things he did, and I don't know, but I wonder about what made him tick and led to some bad decisions. And finally, the important thing about my family is that I have a younger brother who's 11 years younger than me, and I think I've told you guys about this. Yeah, and so I was just like, oh yeah, put the little close symbol between me and my brother, and yeah. But otherwise, I was surprised to notice lots of turmoil up here in the genogram and very quiet down here. I'm like, wow, we are sort of super normal, and I'm like, have we not had time to be really screwed up yet, or have we like consciously tried to deal with some of the stuff that's coming on down, right? And like hopefully it's that, right? Hopefully it's that things aren't going to erupt, but like hopefully that we have been conscious about not perpetuating, any traumas that have occurred over the life of the family. So that's.
I love it. Let me just flip a bunch of those things for you on mine.
Mm-hmm.
How's that?
Yeah.
Because let's see if I can do it. Start screen share. Boom. So all of these people lived within 15, 20 miles of each other.
Wow.
All the way back to 1832. Okay. The things that I noticed, I had a hard time doing triangulation and all that emotional stuff because, to tell you the truth, I'm down here in 1954. Everybody on this, on the generation before me, the generation before me, all that sort of thing. They're basically, I have no knowledge of how Stephen and Margaret got along, or George and Catherine, really. And the only person that is sort of interesting in their death, even, I mean, people died of heart attack and died of cancer, right? But the only one that's interesting is my grandfather, William Naylor, it's over here, who was shot while hunting at 43. He was out deer hunting. And the major trauma of all of that played out in terms of, we were just not a hunting family then. So I was living in central Pennsylvania, heartbed of hunting, and never have picked up a gun in my life. So I don't know, I mean, that's an impact, but I don't know. I don't see something important to tell you about that, how that impacted my father and his brother. I'm sure it did, but I don't have a lot of information there. My dad and his brother, we each had one kid. So me and, him, Bill here, William, on this level. And of all of the 6 siblings in my mother's family, there were only 2 only children, me and my cousin Sally. So it's really an interesting, when I looked at the genogram, it's a focusing of, or narrowing things down, or whatever you want to call it, to the family. Because of course, all of these spouses would have had parent trees and all that kind of stuff. So it really comes down to the 3 of us in this generation that are left. You'll notice that both of my cousins have been divorced. I don't have a spouse. So I don't know whether that's a play out of something that's gone on before. Is the heat down here at the bottom as opposed to, like you were talking about, the heat above? I don't know. And I'd be happy to talk about other questions, but
Do you know why there were few children in your generation?
No, that was not ever, it was not ever discussed. Like, they didn't say, oh, we had miscarriages or anything like that, or whether they just couldn't have children or whatever the deal was. Yeah.
But most of them were married? I mean, you didn't have.
Yeah, they were all married. I don't have all the spouses on here because
Right.
I didn't have dates for them or whatever.
That just seems really unusual. And also, and so your cousin also was married twice, but no children?
Correct. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. That seems pretty unusual.
Yeah, I think so. The other tidbit of history is that these 2, Arthur and Sally, grew up on 2 neighboring farms in York County and married each other and had these 7 kids, 6 of whom survived. So, yeah, that's the family.
Are you close with your cousins?
Not overly, but not distant. I mean, we're not part of each other's lives in that she's in Florida and Arizona, and he's in central Pennsylvania. So.
And you have one nephew?
I have one nephew that I've never met. I've never met this kid because it was an early marriage between these 2 that I think I might have even been in college when he was born, and he had nothing to do with the family after the divorce.
Wow.
So, yeah. Talk about expectations being funneled down to, just, I don't know. Here I am. No wonder I'm the way I am, I guess. Huh?
Are you close with your mom?
Oh, very. She's deceased, but yeah, very.
I didn't see the X. Sorry, I looked
Sorry.
like it wasn't
Yeah, it's fuzzy. Yeah. Everybody on this level is now deceased. So there's nobody that remembers that, or that has actual memory of those generations. Because my mom was 40 when she had me, and my dad was 45. So only child of older parents. Okay.
Cool.
Wow, fascinating.
I think I think you're on, Adam.
Really is. All right, I'll try to share mine now. And this is the first time I made a genogram, so I think it's kind of messy.
Oh, listen, this is a very messy process.
You had it all nice and clean and white, and I wasn't sure how to do that yet. So I hope it uploaded correctly.
Mm-hmm.
But here it is. Yeah. So, and I'm not trying to make it bigger either. It's just there.
Okay, yeah, I can see it.
You can both see it?
Mm-hmm.
I am down here where all the lines are going to, the green lines. I'm the oldest of four. My parents are both still alive and married. My dad is the oldest of five. He's the only boy. His mother died. And I didn't realize till recently how close he was with his mom. My mom, on her last visit here, kind of talked about how they were very close. And his dad was a workaholic. And even after he retired, he volunteered at the grocery store he'd been working at for a number of years, just hanging out. So he was never home. I don't know, I'm just describing this, I guess. All of these are married with kids. All of my aunts on that side. I didn't add all that level because it's pretty messy. My mom is an only child of my grandma and my grandpa, who divorced when she was 11. My grandma told my mom growing up that he was a terrible man, so she didn't know him. He's actually a very, very quiet man. He remarried. They didn't have kids. My grandmother remarried 3 times, so she was married 4 times, which I only knew about 3 till I was in my mid-20s. Apparently there was a short-lived second husband who was abusive. That's a secret that no one talks about, but that my parents told my brother and I when we were a little older. Her third husband was very loving, but he died. And then her fourth husband was the grandpa that I knew on that side, who died 7 years ago or so. But our family, yeah, it's pretty boring. We all kind of get along in my immediate family. Our siblings, I don't visit them enough. They're all in the Midwest, and I'm out in Buffalo. Everybody, my brother has 2 children. I have 2 children. My sister is now engaged to a man named Mustafa, who is originally from Morocco, which is sort of a shock to the rest of the family, but my parents say he's a great guy. I haven't met him yet, but I'm looking forward to it. They're getting married in September. And my youngest brother has 1 child. So I guess I just described this. In terms of emotional relationships, I put a lot of love there, I guess, with the green lines. The big one is my grandmother is really pretty manipulative to my mother at this point. My grandmother and my grandfather, who divorced, are now in the same retirement community in Indiana, where my mom grew up. But my mom goes to visit them every 4 to 6 weeks, and my grandma just sort of berates her a lot. so, when you mentioned triangulation, there's some of that with my grandmother and my siblings. My grandmother treats the women in the family differently than the men, which is just, I don't even know how to say it right. It's just annoying at this point. So I don't know what else to say. If you have any questions or anything about this.
No, I think it's clear, and I think putting the lines of affection or love in there is probably something I should have done. I mean, I don't know what, just as a general comment, I don't know what rises to the level of something that should be put on the genogram.
Yeah, I wasn't sure about that either, so I just kind of haphazardly put in some stuff.
Right. Yeah.
Did my mom have, conversations with her sisters that were problematic at points, I suppose, but they basically got along, loved each other, visited each other, spent time with each other. So I couldn't come up with emotional turmoil.
Yeah, sorry to go back to me, but
No.
but yeah, with my grandma, it's tricky too, because she was always the one who sort of showered us with gifts when she would visit. So as kids, we loved her, and we still do. But I mean, and she still was very affectionate with us. But now that she's kind of on her own and can't travel, it's very much poor me and all this. So I don't know. Yeah, it's that there's the emotional turmoil there, and my mom's right in the middle of it, right? It's that sandwich generation thing where she feels really stuck and she wants help. And I mean, I'm in seminary. I feel like I can't help. We all have jobs, and some of my siblings are more helpful than others. And it's this constant sort of guilt trip at times between my grandma and my mom of, I don't see you very often. And so that's the emotional turmoil in my family. There you have it.
Yeah. Cool.
Okay, well, I think we made it. Any closing comments from anybody? Okay, we'll stop the broadcast.